Hey everybody. So this is a new video in the series on discussing the polar function and what I refer to as domain shifting. I've done a few other videos on it. I'd recommend, if you haven't watched any of the other ones, at least watch the one on polar TE for the INFJs and ISTJ or ISFJs. Because they give a little bit more of a background on what the polar function is and what I mean by domain shifting. But the quick and dirty way to describe it is every type is going to have a polar function, which is going to be the seventh cognitive function or the cognitive function in your seventh slot. And the way to think about it is it's the opposite of whatever the type's third slot is, right? So if you're an INFJ, your third function is going to be introverted thinking, and so the polar function is the opposite of that, extroverted thinking. So for this video, I'm going to talk about the Fi polars types. So those are going to be the ENTPs and the ESTPs, right? So they've got extroverted feeling as their third function. So the opposite is going to be introverted feeling. And the other thing to keep in mind is that they've got introverted thinking as their second function, or what we refer to as their tool function. And when I talk about domain shifting, I'm talking about when a type is presented with some sort of problem or some sort of task where, normally somebody would use one particular function. If that function is polar in a particular type, they'll try to take the task and shift it into a different domain, right? So if you're in that different domain, I would argue is typically your second function or your tool function, right? So if you are Fi polar, like an ENTP or an ESTP, if you're presented with sort of an Fi problem or something that people usually sort of process in the Fi using an Fi function, you're more likely to try to shift it into a TI issue or TI problem, or at least sort of deal with it in a TI way as opposed to an Fi way. So I did a previous video talking about the types that are TI polar, the ENFPs and the ESFPs, and made the point that you see this a lot in just sort of like what we tend to think of as just sort of arguments, like political arguments or religious arguments or anything where people are sort of taking opposite views of a situation. Your typical fights on Twitter, your political fights with your family on Facebook, what you see on CNN, what you see on ESPN, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be political. It could be things like, who's the best basketball player of all time, those sorts of, barroom type arguments that people love to get into online. And in the previous video, when I was talking about the types with TI polar, I talked about how, they tend to avoid a TI basis for their argument and try to shift it into an Fi or an ethics, value-based, cost-benefit sort of analysis, as opposed to a just strictly rational TI, if P, then Q, formalistic, logical solution, right? And so, and that's what TI is doing, as it's engaging in formal logic. And so when presented with sort of a question, to argue, they're going to take a much more TI approach, the ENTPs and the ESTPs, and they're going to avoid the, sort of the Fi arguments, right? So let's take some examples. One of the examples I used in the previous video on the TI polar types was just, sort of a general political economic argument that you see all the time. For example, we've got a situation where a certain percentage of the population in the U.S. lives below the poverty line. And let's just say it's like 20% or something like that. I don't know if it's that high, but just for the sake of the example. And so then, the question arises, okay, well, what can we do? What's a political solution here to this problem? And I would argue, this could be, framed in an FI sort of way. For example, what's sort of the ethically, morally right thing to do here, where society and the individuals are sort of qualitatively better off, right? That they're going to sort of be emotionally better off, from a value based cost benefit viewpoint or framework, where and so that's where a lot of political arguments lie, right? What's sort of best for the people ethically. If somebody is FI polar and presented with that question, how do we solve the poverty problem in the U.S., they're not going to take that FI cost benefit value based sort of approach that the ENFPs or the ESFPs are going to take. They're going to take a much more rational, logical approach. And when I talk about a logical argument, I'm talking about arguments where they follow formal logic to where, as long as all the conditions are true and all the propositions are true, which is a big if, but as long as they are, then you're going to come up with a result that is, if it's valid, is necessarily true, right? It's a necessary conclusion to the argument. And like I mentioned in the other video talking about the TI polars, somebody with FI and TI polar, they just have this sort of natural resistance to any sort of argument that is necessarily true, right? You'll see a lot of them sort of counter it by saying, well, that's just your opinion, right? But the TI users, on the other hand, they're using a much more rational, logic-based function to come up with a conclusion, and they're going to pretty much say the same thing to the FI users, that no, my conclusion is valid and it's true, and your conclusion and the proposal you're making is all sort of ethics based and sort of based loosely off of your opinion, right? And is illogical for XYZ reasons, right? So you see this breakdown in arguments all the time, and of course all the cable stations, the news stations, the sports stations, and then of course Twitter and Facebook. I mean, they just thrive on this, right? That you've got a certain percentage of the population out there that's very engaged in politics or sports or whatever the domain is, and they have very strong opinions one way or the other, or very strong arguments one way or the other, and they just sort of constantly butt heads, right? And sort of think of it as the classic rationalist versus idealistic dichotomy, where the TI users, the ENTP, ESTPs that are using that second function TI and framing everything in a TI sort of domain, they're sort of your rationalists, right? And they can come up with ethical arguments. They can come up with, especially your ENTPs, they'll come up with things like, well, hey, everybody's better off because they have more money in their pocket, or we have, more productivity more jobs, things that can be sort of tied to numbers, right? And even in the economics literature, they'll talk about utils, right? Like, how many utils is something worth? In other words, like what sort of utility does it have for any sort of individual? Is it going to make them happy or not? But it's like sort of reduced down to this very formulaic approach of looking at things. And so you see a lot of ENTPs in the economics world because they have that extroverted intuition, in their dominant function. So they're very good at sort of mapping out and exploring the metaphysical, abstract world. If you pull this lever and push this lever, what's going to happen, sort of in the metaphysical world, right? And so they're very good at that. And then you couple that with their introverted thinking, which is going to be pretty strong, and they'll come up with very logical arguments for different sort of political situations, right? So going back to my example, where, if we're trying to solve the poverty problem, the standard or one of the popular solutions to the problem is, okay, well, how about the government just gives these people who are below the poverty line more money, right? Let's just give them $10,000 a year, or $2,000 a month, or whatever the case may be. And then they'll have more money that they could spend on food and clothing and, their rent, and they'll be able to at least get sort of the basic needs met. And therefore we as society will be better off overall. Where the ENTPs and the folks that are sort of Fi POLR come in and say, well, not so fast, and they come up with the argument, well, if you just throw more money out into the economy, you're just gonna more people will have money, and it might help them in the short term. But eventually what's going to happen is you have more money chasing after the same number of resources, or maybe even fewer resources. And that's just going to result in the overall prices for goods and services going up, right? And so what used to cost $5 last year now costs $6. And so even though people have more dollars in their pocket or in their bank account, they're no better off because now everything that they need to buy cost more, right? So either they're not better off, or maybe they're even worse off, depending on how much the prices went up. So their argument is, they're not going to look at the ethics of it. They're not really looking at, whether people are sort of happier or sad or anything like that. They're looking at it purely from this mechanical monetary supply sort of argument of, if we do this, then this is necessarily the case that, we're going to have higher inflation, right? If you just follow the logic, follow all the pieces, then it's just sort of a necessary outcome that prices are going to go up. And so even though you think you're helping people, in the long run, you might be hurting them. Now, there is a little bit of cost-benefit analysis going on, but again, it's in this very rational, mechanical kind of way, and not in this sort of value ethics-based kind of way. Like, are we, better off, from an ethical standpoint? Same thing for, any other sort of policy arguments that have to do with economics. So, rent controls, are people better off, if you impose, a cap on how much how much landlords can raise their rent, minimum wages, things like that, where the FI response is, hey, everybody's getting more, and so, and everybody's sort of more equal than they had been before, right? And so that's going to solve a lot of the world's problems, where, again, the ENTPs sort of come in and say, no, just sort of look at this logically, and here's where you come out. Okay. So and then they'll by and large ignore the FI piece of the overall issue, right? And again, it's not to say that they can't do sort of an ethics based analysis, but they do it in a very, very different way. It's not based off of values so much as it's sort of based off of sort of are there more jobs? Do people have more money in their pocket? Is the stock market going up? And I always think of my classic go-to for an ESTP would be Donald Trump. And again, we can all debate whether or not he's really an ESTP, but to me, he just seems like such the classic ESTP. And he's the type that when, somebody is arguing for, such and such policy that's going to improve, the overall well-being of those under the poverty line or something, he'll just say, well, just look at the stock market. The stock market's going up. Everybody's got more money in their pocket. We cut taxes, blah, 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 blah. What's the problem? He's one of these just sort of look at the scoreboard kind of guys. And he isn't really taking, he certainly doesn't take sort of the bigger ethical questions into account, right? He has this very practical look at the scoreboard. Everybody's got more money. We got more jobs. We've got, the highest productivity, highest profits that we've ever had as an economy. So what's the problem? and so that's to me, a very ESTP reaction. The ENTPs will get a little bit more nuanced because, they've got that extroverted intuition. So they sort of want to map out the whole space, and they're going to take into account some of the ethical cost-benefit analysis issues. But, I think at the end of the day, their logical argument of, if you increase the money supply, it's going to lead to inflation, or if you, put a cap on, rent control or something, it's going to lead to deteriorating conditions for people who actually live in the apartment because their landowners don't, the landlords don't have any incentive to make repairs or make improvements to the property, so on and so forth. And so, again, they'll take into account sort of the FI based arguments, but they're going to rely on their TI to sort of win the day. And not only that, but they're probably going to ignore the FI part of it until somebody points it out to them. And then they'll just find a way to sort of hand wave it away and say, yeah, but, we're still better off with my TI solution. And then when it comes, so outside of sort of the political domain, it also will pop up in their sort of personal life. So I talked in the other video about, people like, some of the famous performers that enter into these bad contracts where they personally feel affronted by, the money that they're losing out on, and that, the record label or the movie studio is keeping, sort of at their expense, right? They're like, hey, I'm the one that, came up with all this stuff. Why don't I get the money? Where, the opposite argument is, well, you wouldn't even have a career if it wasn't for our movie studio or our record label. And we're sort of the reason you have all this money. And not only that, but, just sort of rationally speaking, 20% of our artists make all of our money, and we lose money on 80% of our artists, so 80% of the bands and 80% of the TV shows, we lose money on. And so for the 20% that actually make money, we've got to keep our share, right? And so this is a very TI logic based argument that isn't taking into account anybody's sort of feelings or values or ethics. It's just a pure, look, this is just the way that the business model works, and the economics of it. And so you see this constant conflict, right? And so again, the ENTPs, the ESTPs, especially the ESTPs, they're probably more likely to be in the business context. They're going to just take this very, rational based approach. Like, look, I'm running a business here. I gotta make money, and I can't really take into account your feelings and whether or not you personally feel affronted by, the pure economics of the situation, right? And again, they'll sort of point to the scoreboard, like, "Look, we're all making money here. Well, why are you unhappy? You're making way more money than you were before, and we're making money, so everybody should be happy." And again, just sort of ignoring that FI piece of the puzzle, right? That where the performer, the Dave Chappelle's or the Kanye Wests or whoever, just sort of have this, personal FI, moral quandary with it. Like, oh my, you guys didn't really contribute anything other than just sort of the money and the distribution and the marketing and all this other stuff that they're not really thinking about. But this stuff is my stuff, and and I have sort of a moral right to it, and I should be able to say what's done with it and what I should get paid for it. And this isn't trying to take one side of the argument or anything, but you can just see how they would sort of just naturally butt heads if you're looking at it from different frameworks, right? And so the other way I see it pop up a lot is in the shows like on ESPN or even CNN, Fox News, where they've got different talking heads that are supposed to take different sides of an issue, right? And usually it boils down to taking an FI approach versus a TI approach. And so for a show like ESPN, and I don't know if they're doing this consciously or unconsciously, but it's sort of just, evolved to this, to where they realize that, you get an ESTP and an ESFP on stage together and just, especially in the sports arena, and just have them hammer it out. That makes for good television, right? Because the ESTP is going to be taking a very TI-based approach to whatever the argument is, where the ESFP is going to be taking a very FI approach. They're both sort of ignoring the framework that the other person's coming from and arguing that, their framework or their way of looking at it is the same. So they're really not even arguing on the merits of the argument, right? That, whether or not the other person's right or wrong. They're arguing about the fact that the other person's framing it, the question incorrectly, right? They're thinking about the question the wrong way. So, for example, the classic, who's the best NBA player of all time, right? When they have time to kill and it's a slow news day, they're going to pull out an ESFP and an ESTP, put them on stage and just say, okay, who's the best basketball player of all time? And you'll see the ESFP, personality type taking a very FI sort of, or making a very FI type of argument using an FI framework, where they're thinking of, just sort of their own personal value and what they would assign to these different players. And, sort of the way they sort of frame it is, if I could pick between LeBron James and Michael Jordan as my teammate, who would I pick? Like, who do I value more? Who do I assign sort of a higher value that's going to benefit me at a lower cost, or all things being equal? Who's going to benefit me the most? Who's the better value here? Just from a pure, again, just FI analog cost benefit values based sort of argument, right? And they're not looking at other things that like the TI users are using. So the TI, the ESTPs, they're going to be pulling out all the stats, right? They're going to pull out, who has the most championships, who has, the most NBA All-Star appearances, who has the better free throw percentage or field goal percentage or, what have you. And so they're going to take this very sort of logical type approach where it's necessarily the case, right, that Michael Jordan is the better player than Kobe or LeBron James because he's got more titles. He had a better shooting percentage. I don't know if that's true or not, but they'll find some stats that work in Michael Jordan's favor and add up to him being better than the other two players, right? Now, of course, the thing that they're probably not taking into account is just the stats that they pick are sort of FI type things, right? Like, you have to assign a certain value to those stats for them to be meaningful, right? Because in the football world, there's a lot of people, not so much anymore, but there was a time where a lot of people would try to make the argument that Dan Marino is the best quarterback of all time because he had all these great regular season stats, but he never won a Super Bowl, right? And so the TI users would pull out all the other stats and sort of ignore the fact that he never won a Super Bowl, but the FI users would kind of throw that in their face and say, you're ignoring the fact that he never won a Super Bowl. That seems like a pretty, important factor in figuring out who the best of all time is. So, so they're assigning different values to those stats. Like, they're not just taking them at face value. They're arguing whether or not they're, should be included in the first place. Okay, anyways, enough of that diversion. But hopefully you see sort of the conflict, the inner conflict between the FI tool user and the TI tool user, and the fact that, the FI tool user is TI polar, the TI user is FI polar, and you're going to see this constant battle between them because, not only are they, they might be trying to come up with an answer to a question, but they're framing it in a completely different way, right? And again, think of politics where, you have one side of the spectrum that's making a very ethical, values-based, hey, this is the type of people we are, and we should be, taking care of everybody at whatever cost. And the other side just saying, look, if we do this, just sort of logically speaking, if you just work through the problem, you'll realize that we're going to end up worse off than we otherwise would have, right? And so let's think of other solutions here rather than just sort of the automatic sort of value-based, ethic-based solution. Again, with the ENTPs and the ESTPs, I'm not trying to bag on anybody. I'm not trying to say they're, completely unfeeling, unethical people. I mean, I do think that they do get the ethics, but they look at it in a very different framework than just sort of your basic FI type is going to. And, they like to, assign numbers to things or measurements to things in order to insert them into their logic calculator, right? And so any sort of ethical argument, if you're dealing with an ENTP or an ESTP and you're trying to make an ethical argument with them, don't be surprised if they come back and say, okay, I guess I can understand your argument, but here's all, the things you're not taking into account. And here's how, if you implement your policy or do what you want to do, here's going to be the natural, necessary conclusion to doing that, and you're going to be worse off, right? And so if you're interacting with somebody like that, you've got to make sure that you realize they're sort of ignoring the FI part of it. They could be ignoring the larger ethical values based argument, and you have to sort of rope them into that, and sort of acknowledge the fact that yes, their TI argument is valid and it's true and it's convincing, and we're not trying to tell them that they're wrong, but even if that is the sort of worst result that could happen, we'll deal with that, right? We're still better off from an ethical standpoint or an FI standpoint by doing what I want to do. Even if it means increases in prices or whatever, like we'll come up with another solution to that when we get to it, kind of argument. And they can get pretty prickly, if you're attacking them on their argument, right? Because like I said in the other video with the TI polar types, they have this tendency when somebody gives them sort of a logical argument for why they think something is the case or not the case, they have this tendency to be like, well, that's just your opinion, because they're sort of ignoring the logic rationalism of it and just sort of thinking that, well, everything is opinion based. All arguments are opinion based because that's how they view the world. That's how they frame everything, as sort of these opinion based arguments, these ethical arguments, and sort of ignore the fact that there's just these sort of just straight up logical arguments that aren't taking into account the ethics. So if you happen to be TI polar and you're an ESFP or an ENFP and you're dealing with an ESTP or an ENTP and you're having that battle of the polar types, keep in mind that they're not going to be as persuaded by the FI ethical arguments, and you can't just tell them that their TI argument is just their opinion or not necessarily the case, or try to poke holes in it, because chances are it's a pretty strong argument and it's pretty valid. The question is whether or not you're willing to live with the conclusion that they came up with. Like, are you willing to live with the fact that prices are going to increase? Are you willing to live with the fact that if you impose rent controls, the properties are going to start deteriorating because the owners won't put any money into them, that kind of thing? Or, do you have a solution to that if it happens, that kind of thing? So instead of telling them, that they're just flat out wrong and, that they're thinking about the problem the wrong way, you have to acknowledge that, yeah, I get it. That's probably, likely to happen. That's probably a natural outcome of this policy or this argument or whatever. But I'm willing to live with that and, and address it in these other particular types of ways. And then you can actually sort of maybe make some middle ground and meet them halfway. ENTPs, ESTPs, it's kind of weird because you think of ESTPs as sort of being the wheeler and dealers and sort of, they always get what they want out of a negotiation, the art of the deal, kind of Donald Trump type of wheeling and dealing. And you would think that that's very FI driven, like, they're going to get the most out of this deal as possible. But in a way, I had to sort of think through this a little bit more, but in a way, it's almost like they're just ignoring the FI part of it, right? Like they just want, there's gold stars, there's money to be had, and everything reduces to dollars or, levels of prestige, right? Like they're going to get the job and nobody else is going to get the job. I'm going to be president and nobody else is going to be president, or I'm going to make $1 billion off this, and nobody else is going to make $1 billion off of this. It's a very sort of uh, measurable, I guess, kind of thing. And so it's not like, so if they go into a negotiation and they're working on a deal, it's not like, this is going to make me happy. This is going to make my family happy. This is the best moral outcome for me. It's the exact opposite. It's just like, I'm going to make the most money. I'm going to walk away with the most dollars. And maybe with an ENTP, they're thinking more of like, I'm going to win the argument. I'm going to have the best argument, and I'm going to win the debate or whatever. Or I'm going to get all the, academic recognitions, like the Nobel Prizes and all that kind of stuff that you get when you're like top level ENTP. So it's a lot of scoreboard painting or pointing, and not so much like, I'm doing this because it makes me feel good about myself, right? And in fact, it's almost the opposite, and so when you're negotiating with an ESTP, especially, you can't just sort of focus on, well, aren't you going to be happier taking this job versus that job? Or, yeah, you might take less in salary, but you'll be happier because you won't have to work as much. Or, there'll be more money for everybody else. Like, oh my God, don't tell them that. But you can imagine somebody trying to make a negotiation argument with an ESTP and just say, well, if you take less money, then there'll be more money for everybody else, and that'll be good for the company. That's probably not an argument that's going to hold a lot of water, because that's much more of a sort of value-based, cost-benefit, ethical argument that just isn't going to fly with them. Because again, they want gold stars. They want the most dollar, the most shares, or the most the most prestigious position, that kind of stuff. Things that they can point to and say, haha, I got that. Because again, when they're trying to solve whatever problem it is, they're thinking of it in this very logical way. Like, what's going to end up with the highest result, highest dollars, highest prestige position, best location, whatever, right? They've got some sort of measurable criteria that they're using. And in their mind, they're figuring out a formula that gets them the best thing. And they're not really taking into account whether or not they're going to be overall happy or satisfied or sad or anything. Like, they just want the most, whatever it is. Okay, so I hope this helps differentiate the FI domain shifting. I'm happy to elaborate, do more videos, but this is probably enough for now. So the next set of videos I'm going to be doing is the perception functions, so intuition and sensing, and what happens when you've got polar on in those functions, and what types of domain shifting you see. So looking forward to that. If you've got any questions, comments, feel free to post below. All right, thanks. Bye.